Hello. The title of my presentation is Public Space and Social Media: New Politicization Possibilities, Echo Chambers, or Fore of Neopopulism. I'll try to share my screen to have a look of my presentation. So, we start introducing the term. The concept of the public sphere has been dynamically introduced into modern thought since the early 1960s, when Jürgen Habermas defined a space where individuals converse with each other and criticize issues related to public life without limitations and constraints. It is a sphere of discourse with practices distinct from those of the state apparatus, and in which the issues of everyday life are discussed in a free and unrestricted way. What matters is not so much the specificity of this space as the overall accessibility to it and the interaction within it. Word is expressed by anyone and addressed to anyone. Printed word form is also a particular importance in the formation and expression of opinions. With the assistance of the written word, but also of the mass media, a structural transformation of the public sphere takes place, in which the urban audience is homogenized and abstract individuals turn into the differentiated audience of civil society. All this meant a new conception of the modern city, in which ideally its members could seek and find a valuable consents for their common future. The contradictions, however, of this dynamic are also demonstrated its limits along the way. Walking on the same path, there have been many critical approaches to the same concept as an intermediate space between the domain of the private and the state. The emergence of social media. Electronic social networking media, in their various forms, email communities, blogs, etc., begin to appear at the end of the last century. Their initial operating conduce their initial stage is characterized by the creation of the online infrastructure, the search for their operating contours, and the gradual formation of what will be called the platform society, that is, the independence of these heterogeneous mechanisms. Gradually, the sizes increase, spread across different fields, attract research interest, and connect to more social aspects. As the landscape moves toward completion, interest is rapidly shifting from simple communication to commercial interest and political exploitation. Within layout of new settings, each social component, social organizations, state institutions, political parties, media, etc., seeks its own place. It is now clear that this digital mediation between private and public space by the platform societies is restructuring social dynamics. The new public space is co-shaped through heterogeneous components of diverse perceptions standing next to each other, new cultural imaginaries, practices followed by ordinary users and professionals, technological architectures, and business models. These connections in turn bring some additional data. First, sociocultural activity is deeply intertwined and therefore interacts with techno-economic digital infrastructure, with all that this entails. Beyond that, the new political economy of the public landscape constitutes a mosaic of complexity and sometimes contradictions in which the self-evident have no place in particular. This in turn means that the correct assessment of the new conditions does not favor one-dimensional approaches, but the widest possible view of this innovative and multifaceted dynamic. 3. Politicization through social media. First of all, we have to see the new audience. In this new picture that shapes the landscape of social media, some clear deviation from the Habermasian proposal can be found. First, the audience of the public space is active in other contexts with different forms of information and social practices than those the German philosopher had in mind. Now it is a set of citizens that operates relatively anonymously, partially invisible, since it has access to the media and with the morphological limitations that they place on the monitoring of communication. A different issue is the commercialization of the media. Social media operate in terms of privacy in the sense that their owners monitor the movements of users, not in complete ignorance of the latter, and after analyzing them, promote and develop specific consumption practices and products. The ancient Greek agora, that is, forum, operates in both dimensions of its concepts, both economic and political. The second one is about the relationship among social media and mass movements. Separately, however, the social media function in the direction of strengthening the collective stands out. It is an obvious kind of creating new identities or a new way of expressing common identities. The development of community feeling, solidarity, and mutual support found a vital space in the groupings formed digitally. The online way is a way of forming collective identities and further multiplies the voices of individuals. Petitions, protests, and activism derive much of their momentum from the capability of social media. Through posts, hashtags, retweets, etc., ideas are exchanged and spread, calls to action find ground to grow, and simple communication is transformed into political action, sometimes on a large scale. Discomfort and indignation may initially manifest themselves in a virtual way as a kind of cloud protesting, but sometimes relatively soon they will be expressed in the real world. It should not be considered as a coincidence, however, that the greatest mobilizations of our time were supported by social media. The advantages of rapid communication, especially this of Twitter, self-expression, and sharpening of political polarization offered by social media have not gone unnoticed by activists and have been used almost exclusively to spread ideas and organize their movements. At the same time, however, they also influenced the form of these movements, as shown by studies of the uptake of the data offered by the social media to their users. Third is the introversion of the social media. Nevertheless, this development has another peculiarity. Social media users are basically organized in groups of like-minded people, for example, on the same Facebook pages. So the circulation of ideas is not distinguished so much for its critical character as for the escalation of admiration of the fans. It is estimated, therefore, that the design of media supports their function rather as echo chambers, where a reverberation chamber was actually used as a sound effects room, producing echoes so that during a recording it is creating a feeling as if the conversation took place in a larger room. Now, the term broadly refers to digital communication where users choose to enter media where they will only hear their echo of their own voice. In some cases, in fact, the social media algorithms, which determine the approach of the user, cooperate in this regard, so the technological morphology of each medium interacts with the form of social involvement. A more or less vast area of information or opinions is thus created, which the user himself does not see and does not want to see. Thus, everyone consumes opinions similar to his or her own ones, relays others that agree with them, and constructs a version of reality that is favorable to them. Inevitably, this morphology and the mentality it cultivates contribute at the same time to the aforementioned increase in political polarization, the easier adoption of radical attitudes and extreme forms of action, but also to the more favorable prevalence of a populist climate. By the lack of serious dialogue and critical interventions, but also with the predominance of cheers instead of disagreements or debate, popularity of electronic pages is conquered by their agreed supporters. This image essentially affects the quality of political discourse and therefore of democratic functioning, as differentiation and necessary reflection is discouraged and the recycling of similar ideas and perceptions prevails. Many times, this phenomenon of fenced politicization is found to mark a limit to the temporal scope of socio-political action. At the same time, protagonists of the political groups transfer their profile centers of gravity inside their space. This aspect of the political side of social media can explain why not only older people, but also citizens with more education are more likely to engage in an offline political behavior, that is, regardless of the use of electronic media. Fourth is the exploitation of the social media by the governing groups. Another fact that is recorded nowadays concerns the increasing involvement of governments and political figures in the social media. It's now evident that elected officials are turning to these new ways of communicating with constituents, with novel terms of interaction, evolving codes of ethics, and generally opaque control guidelines. This particular aspect becomes important in cases of restriction and prohibition, which are obviously in direct opposition to the specification of the original ideas of Habermas, and in what is understood as the public sphere since then, beyond the sensitive issue of violations of freedom of speech. It would be hopelessly utopian and romantic, however, to expect the ruling elites to remain mere spectators of events and not bother to intervene in an advantageous way for themselves. In recent times, it is becoming less and less rare the court to be concerned with a right to prohibit the participation, that is, the non-term blocking of persons and activities in some social media. It is examined, for example, whether it is legal for a company to block certain messages or a politician to block a user who posts critical comments about him. Corresponding questions also arise with reports to person or even for the blocking in social media, since these means are considered public space. On the other hand, issues arise where citizens consider that the policy of a social medium is directed against them or against the rights of minorities. For their part, social media present corresponding prohibitions that they post on government, organization, or officials, claiming that they do not discriminate when they consider that the principles they have set are being violated. As a special case and extremely worrisome for the future is the fact of governmental pressure towards social media for specific actions of a political nature against persons or groups, for example, suspension of activist accounts or pages of groups used for planning rallies, must be considered. Incidents of harassment, tracking, and even targeting of persons who are politically active, monitoring of social political websites, closing them in times of social unrest, or systematic restrictions on their use, as well as internet services in general, have already been recorded on the part of specific regimes. In epilogue, we have already entered a historical period where the status of a citizen is more and more intertwined with that of the internet user of social media. The new term netizenship obviously captures this reality. It is clear that modern political scene differs in many points from the open framework of the public space, as at least it was formulating during its initial conception. It may in many aspects offer important possibilities for communications, but it includes aspects that degrade it and undermine its offer to man. Once again, our space's achievements are ambivalent, and it takes vigilance and sensitivity rather than the usual reckless enthusiasm or equally uncritical denial to assess them in their proper dimensions and perspective. Thank you very much for your attention.